I think one of the first things, Favor, when I first came to Nigeria in 2006, one of the things that really stands out as a foreigner visiting Nigeria for the first time is the frequent power outages. And you quickly learn as a foreigner to the country that NEPA stands for something along the lines of never expect power again, or a variation on that. And of course, it's from decades of the power system not being able to function in the way that meets the needs of the very high population. And I think at one point when I was first working around power sector reform, there was a stat along the lines that Keith Hammond, the infrastructure advisor, would use, that for a country the size of Nigeria, which I think at that point was probably around 180 million, something like that, it was producing the same equivalent amount of power that's produced in the West Midlands region in the UK, which is a much smaller population. And so at that point, it was all about generation and how do you increase generation and all the rest of it. But it's been a long history, a long sort of up and down history. And I think that's why, from my perspective, it's wonderful to bring in a special guest today who's been an intrinsic part of the power reforms in various phases and in various ways. So who have we got, Favor, on our show? Could you want to do a bit of an introduction?
Yes, thank you, Richard. So I would want to say the opposite was the case for me as a citizen. I didn't know that other countries didn't have lights when I was young. And so I felt almost betrayed. I think it's okay if like European nations or America, but learning that other African countries don't struggle, I felt betrayed, like my whole life had been a lie. So yes, and I'm happy that today we are moving away from just the theoretical aspects. We're actually going to go really deep and go under the skin of these issues with our very special guest, just as Richard said, Patrick Okigbo III. So I'm just going to go over to him to introduce himself and just tell us a bit about himself. Yes.
Thank you, Richard and Favor, for having me. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I lead a firm, Nextier, where we work at the intersection of policy, markets, institutions, and especially around energy and economic governance. I am particularly interested in the questions around why big reforms sometimes fail to compound, and what it takes for sectors like the electricity sector in Nigeria to shift from just a constant crisis management to a self-reinforcing improvement cycle, which I think that's what this podcast, Flywheel, is about. So over the past decade and a half or so, I've had quite an active role in many, if not all, the reforms in the Nigeria power sector. And if not an active role, but a clear ringside seat in those conversations and actions. So I guess that's why I'm on the podcast today.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so breaking this down for our audience who may be less familiar with Nigeria, what does the power situation mean in practical terms for households and small businesses? What does it mean in practice these days?
Richard, you've already done that. You've already aired the dirty linen by saying that NEPA stands for Never Expect Power Always. And NEPA was the power company that ran Nigeria's infrastructure until the reforms of 2013. But I guess I'm jumping ahead. For the average Nigerian, the Nigeria electricity problem is really less about the absence of wires, but more about unreliable service. So on average, a home or a business would receive probably less than 6 hours of power every day. And there could be extended periods, when there is no power at all. So if you look at the situation in Nigeria, you'd say that what we run is pretty much like a hybrid grid, where self-generation from petrol or diesel generators, increasingly solar panels, batteries, and inverters become the primary source of electricity for most homes and businesses. And the national grid becomes like a backup supply, and that's when it shows up. The challenge has persisted for decades, probably going back 4 decades. And it's really about how we've treated power And it's created a psychological problem where Nigerians begin to depend on themselves to provide power versus relying on the national grid. And this has significant implications when we get into it in the conversations around willingness to pay, the politics around reforms, and the investment decisions. So this has been the status quo for us for many decades. And if you want to get down to some numbers, we have today installed capacity of maybe about 12,500 megawatts. But what gets delivered to homes and businesses hovers around 4,000, 5,000 megawatts. And we can get into the reasons for this, but that's really the situation on ground.
Thank you, Patrick. So just sticking with this Genesis story, I understand that there's a lot of jargon when it comes to the power sector. I mean, we hear things like Genco, Disco, Transco. So like that is the question for total beginners or people that are just interested in sector. What exactly do these terms mean? What's a Genco? What's a Disco? What's a transmission company? What is the role of NERC? And how do they all fit together when we get to the bottom of it?
Okay, yeah. So it could feel like a bit of an alphabet soup for people who are just engaging with the sector. So let's start from the beginning. So electricity, think about it like you create the electricity by taking gas as a fuel, or you take hydro water, and either the gas or the gas generates some steam, or the water falls on a turbine that rotates and generates a couple of things that then turns into electricity, right? Any company that goes through that process of taking a fuel source and turning it into electrons is called a generating company. And shorthand for it, we say a GENCO, generating company GENCO. What they produce, the electrons they produce, they pass through a couple of wires and it ends up in these major trunk lines that you see when you're driving down the freeway, the express roads, etc. Those big wires, what we also call the high tension wires. That's like the backbone. That's the national grid. That's what carries power from where it's generated across the country to where the people are. And the company that manages that grid is called the Transmission Company of Nigeria. And sometimes it's called TCN, and some people will call it Transisco. Yeah. When they get the power to where it's needed, it's dropped in, let me use the more popular terms that we know, like a transformer. But it goes through a couple of things before it gets to your transformer. But the company that takes that power, transforms it and steps it down from the high tension to power that can come into your home is called the distribution company. So they get the power and they distribute it to where it's needed, to homes, to businesses, etc. Those distribution companies we also call discos. Yeah, not to be mistaken for what we do after work on Fridays, but discos. Okay. Now, the discos own all the wires, the transformers, and all the stuff that brings the power into your home. But if we left these guys on their own, there is no certainty that they will take decisions that are in the best interest of the people. And that's why the government set up a referee to ensure that there are rules and that everybody follows those rules. And the referee is the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Company, NERC, or most people would say NERC. And the NERC is the referee, the regulator that ensures that everybody plays according to the rules of the game. These are the big actors, but there are a couple of other actors, and as their names come up in the course of our conversation, I'll explain some more.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, reflecting on the point earlier about 12,000 megawatts being generated by the GENCOs, and then 4,000 making its way through on that. I guess, is it through to the houses? Is that right? Is it sort of through the transmission system through the distribution network into homes? But then also, like, if I drive around my part of the UK, it's a very rainy, wet part of the UK. It doesn't get an awful lot of sunlight, but most of the houses have solar panels on the roof. It's feeding it. Most of them feed into the grid in one way or another. There's some sort of, you can rely. Some houses will have battery backup systems. Others will just feed it straight through to the grid. Nigeria clearly has huge capacity. It's a sunny country, right? Yes, there's a bit of rain, particularly down in Lagos sometimes in the rainy season, but it strikes me that you shouldn't be in a less fortunate situation to the UK in terms of solar generation. You've also got great potential with hydropower in parts of the country, the north of the country, and other parts. What's the challenge here? Why is it so little flowing through?
Okay, so there are. How do we start with this question? Our problem is not a lack of resources, So let me even start with the installed capacity we have. At the start of the show, I mentioned we've got about 12,500 megawatts, but the homes and businesses are getting about 4,000, 5,000 megawatts. What's the problem? The big problem here is that grid that I talked about that connects the generating company's GenCo to the distribution company has a massive constraint. The highest capacity we have on that grid is 7,500. So think about it this way. The GenCos can produce 12,500 liters of water. But at any point, only 7,500 liters of water can go through this pipe. So that means that generation is not the problem here. We're generating almost twice what we can transmit to the homes. Now, when we transmit the 7,500 liters of water, I'm using water because that's what most people can relate to, and it gets to the homes, there is also a challenge within the distribution companies that they have an inability to take the 7,500 and distribute all of that to the people. There are some losses that could be technical, old equipment, broken down equipment, etc. There are problems with connecting to the homes. So all of these losses, mean that of the 7,500 we get, we're only able to distribute about 4,500, sometimes up to 6,000, but there's a limit to what we can distribute. So you spoke at the beginning of the show, Richard, about, when we thought Keith Hammond, thought at the time that the problem was generation, and with the support of the UK government and many other partners, we focused on increasing generation. We achieved that, but we did not take a systems view that there is also a big problem with transmission. Transmission remains in the hands of government. So after the 2013 privatization, when we privatized the GenCos, privatized the DISCOs, transmission remained in the hands of government. And we haven't been able to increase that capacity to match the generation capacity we have. So that's one big problem. But if you dig even deeper into the issues, we've got other problems. So yes, we've got gas, we've got hydro in many parts of the country, not just in the north, but in many parts where we even have smaller streams that you can use 5 meters headroom to generate hydropower. We've got solar capacity all across the country, especially in northern Nigeria. We've got solar radiation, that could power homes from, 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning to 7 in the evening. We've got wind, offshore wind in the south, massive wind capacity everywhere in the north. So it's not a question of the resources. By the way, the entire country sits on especially the southern part, the Niger Delta part, sits on a bed of gas. So the problem is not the resources. If it's not the resources, what then is the problem? So let's forget the technical problem that I defined, but you've also got just a commercial problem where for the failure to pay, these distribution companies are unable to receive monies from power supplied, and the money does not flow back up the chain. So the transmission company cannot pay its bills. The generation companies cannot pay for the gas or that they've used in generating the power. They can't maintain their equipment. And those constraints, mean that we are unable to generate the power with the resources that we have. So it's not just a technical problem. It's not just a commercial problem. We also have collection problems. Yeah, where because we have not deployed meters to homes, we have an inability to collect. So it's really a systems problem.
That's really fascinating, Patrick. And you mentioned earlier about what this podcast is about, what Flywheel Economics is about. It's treating economies as ecosystems, and we believe strongly that economists should be less like engineers and more like gardeners, trying to nurture that ecosystem and bring things out. If though I were acted like a traditional economist and put the engineering hat on, I would say, well, look, this is a really simple problem, right? You've got generation capacity of 2,500 megawatts. You've got a transmission system and distribution network that can only flow through 4,000 or whatever megawatts. Surely this is just a problem of sorting out that bit, and then it will be fine, or there'll be a big improvement, right? So why you spoke a bit about billing and other things. Why is it not that simple? Why can't we just be engineers and solve the problem by mandating the transmission company of Nigeria to do better and do more?
So I think the problem is that we've focused on the power sector like engineers. We've thought this was an engineering problem, increase the generation and you solve all the problems. But that's not it. It's more complicated than that. And I think that's what your podcast is getting to, that this is not really a steels and concretes problem. It's a market system that's broken. It's a cash flow system that doesn't flow. It's a lack of credibility. And it goes into many of the issues around how government subsidized tariffs for a long while, even to the point where Nigerians felt that power was a social good and not a product that you paid for. So government provided all these subsidies, billions of investment went to paying off debt that had accrued in the sector because money wasn't flowing back up the chain. So we had things like the distribution companies were unable to deploy meters in homes and businesses, and then resorted to estimated billing. And this is probably a Nigerian, maybe you find some of it in India as well, where the distribution companies are unable to deploy meters, and then they estimate what they think that you consumed every month, and they send you a bill. And if you're on the receiving end of that, you're like, I didn't consume this much. Why should I be paying this much? And that leads to other unintended consequences where people are trying to circumvent the metering, illegally connect, etc. All of this constitutes, commercial losses to the system. And what has happened over time is that we've accrued billions and billions of naira in debt, which the government steps in from time to time to wipe out those debts, and then creates a moral hazard because those who run the discos believe that they can get away with indiscipline because they are too big to fail, and government would always step in. So what we have here is not primarily an engineering problem. It is a coordination problem. So when I think about the sector, I see like a music orchestra and a coordinator trying to get different parts to play in sync. And we just have not been able to master that act of getting everybody to play in sync.
Thank you, Patrick. So I liked the way you began your previous answer about how resources are not the problem, and so sticking to this narrative of the issues that is currently ongoing in this sector. For most Nigerians, especially if you're active on the internet, one phrase that everybody dreads to see is national grid is down. And so we know that billions of dollars have been invested in the power sector over several decades, yet this grid is still highly unstable. So what is the major bottleneck, and why hasn't capital alone been enough to fix it?
So it's what I've tried to explain, that capital cannot, throwing money at it will not solve it. There are some historical bad behavior that we've accrued that continues to affect the sector. And let me see if I can unpack some of them. One is that over many decades, people hardly paid for electricity. And there was a belief that if we have the gas free of charge in our earth, and if we've got a government that doesn't do much for the people, then the least the government can do is provide electricity pretty much for free. And we have a government that has subsidized not just electricity, but fuel, gasoline, etc. And what has happened is just we've created a sense of dependence and so many other moral hazards. And then when we get to a stage where the government is now trying to privatize and reform, people are not used to paying for it. Build on the back of that they're not getting the power anyway. So it comes down to a chicken and egg, which comes first. Do you expect the people to pay and then use the money and fix the power? Or do you fix the power and then get the people to see, okay, now we're getting reliable power, we need to pay for it? So there are a lot of things that went bad over time that we're now dealing with. And we haven't had, in the past, since we started the reforms, haven't had a bit of a consistency in government's attitude to many of these problems. Going back to the Buhari, let's even go back to Jonathan, which is a government I kind of worked in. And at the time when the NERC, remember NERC is a referee and sets the rules, sets the tariffs, etc. When NERC was supposed to do a tariff review to bring Nigerians closer to paying a cost-reflective tariff, that is a tariff that takes care of all the costs that went into producing the power, it ran up against the elections, and the Jonathan administration imposed or leaned on the regulator at the time not to do the tariff review. They went to that election, lost. A more socialist government came into power, and that was Buhari's government. And for many years, we could not revise the tariff to bring it to become cost reflective. What then happened was, the consumers, when they paid, never paid a tariff that represented what was used or what it cost to produce the power that they used. So we kept building up debt. When the government saw that this was a problem, they stepped in with so many interventions from the Central Bank of Nigeria that wiped out the debt. And that created this, terrible moral hazard where owners of the assets in the sector felt that there will always be Big Daddy that would step in and clear the problems. So what we have is not just a technical problem. It's not a problem that just pushing money on can solve. There is some psychological issues around it, but it's really a coordination problem where government shows that indiscipline will not be tolerated in the sector. People will do what they're supposed to do. You pay or you get cut off, and so on and so forth. So it's a mix of many things to solve this problem.
So, Patrick, do you think that a more disciplined approach is politically palatable?
Do we have a choice? And Richard, the question you've raised is what keeps coming up every time we talk about how badly behaved people are in the country and how they need to be called to order. We raise this question of the political economy of it. Are we ready for it? There's always an election coming, etc. And I say, we've tried that road for many years. It hasn't worked. Why don't we just do the right thing? The law is the law. The rules are the rules. They're on the books. Everybody knows what it is. Bring down the big stick. Do what you need to do and let the chips fall where they are. When I say this, people say I'm being a bit flippant and I'm being a bit careless with power. But remember, this is the same argument that was made about reforming or removing the subsidy on petroleum products. And the current administration came in and they did it. And the heavens did not fall. So sometimes we arrogate so much powers to people, and it holds us back from taking the difficult decisions we must take as a people, or else we'll all drown in this sinking ship.
Thanks, Patrick. I remember probably around 2011 when I first joined DFID Nigeria. So I came back to Nigeria under the UK government. And Keith Hammond, who I mentioned earlier, was the infrastructure advisor. He served for quite a long period of time, well known in the sector, I think, Patrick, and you worked very closely with him as well. But I remember speaking with him early on and just my confusion because, this point I made on solar earlier, right? You could do some back of the envelope calculations and you could just look at what, an equivalent number of solar panels would cost for the typical home to power the typical home, what the battery packs would cost. And you could compare that not with the grid, but the primary source of power that most people were using when they were having power, which was sort of petrol generators or sometimes diesel generators if they were bigger. And you could show that it was much more cost effective to use solar. And yet for many years, there was very slow uptake, whether that was because of access to capital or whether that was because obviously you have to pay up front for the units rather than a generator where you're paying as you go based on fuel. So whether it was access to finance or whether it was trust in the quality of solar units, right? If I'm buying this solar system, is it going to last for 10 years or is it going to spoil within 2 years? Is it going to be fake or whatever? And so you had those challenges, but they felt very easy to overcome or possible to overcome. Yet it still took a number of years before solar became more widespread. Likewise, I think in 2017, 2018, around that time, I visited Lagos, and there was a really nice example where there was, I think it was liquefied natural gas power facility down there, which was being run on a sort of private basis, and it was providing electricity to the state government, to some big hotels, and it was being run like a commercial venture, and it was working. It was delivering. And traditionally, the federal government have had a monopoly on the power sector, right? They've been the ones that have decided what happens to this national grid. Recently, I understand there's been a change in the law that allows states to pick up a little bit more room in this area. Do you mind speaking through what the implications of that change in the law are and what potential that offers Nigeria?
So this is a very important question you've raised. Up until 2023, the Nigeria power sector was run as one monolithic unit. And what I mean by that is you've got the generating companies that are all over the place, privatized in 2013. So private companies now own them, which were hitherto government assets. The distribution companies placed around the country, served the entire country, privately run, etc. But you still had the transmission company owned by the government. And remember, that's where the main bottleneck still is, because of the capacity constraints, 7,500 megawatts at this time. In 2023, government decided to decentralize, and just devolve powers down to the states. And what it means is that state governments can now run their own markets, their own electricity markets. What does this mean in practice? It means that the state governments can set up a state electricity regulatory company that kind of still works with the National Electricity Regulatory Company, but they can manage all the issues within their state. The state can own its own generating assets. It can own its own distribution assets, and it can build its own transmission within the state. So Nigeria has 36 states plus the Federal Capital Territory. If this runs well in practice, it means that you'd have 37 state electricity markets where the governor of the state, through the state regulator, can license generators, license a transmission company, and license distribution. And in theory, it should lead to increased generation. There are some states that have access to gas. Most of the states in the south, some parts of the southeast. Most of the states up north do not have gas, at least in commercial quantities as at this time, which means that they need to look for other sources of fuel. But they also have hydro. Many of the massive hydro plants are in the north. In addition, they have solar. All of everything north of Abuja, has massive solar radiation. They've got massive potential in wind. So what this means is that every state in Nigeria has some resource or the other that it can use in generating power within the state. And now that they're licensed to manage their assets, they should be able to solve the power problem in the state. Makes sense in theory, but when we get to practice, it becomes a bit of a challenge. The challenge I see that you can have, the positive is that you can have, using your terms, 37 flywheels, right? But you can also have 37 discordant, challenging solutions that may not connect well with the grid, because you still need the national grid to transmit power between the states. So you could have that problem. Number two, you could have challenges with capacity. Regulatory capacity, the talent to be able to regulate a power sector are quite, unique. We must thank the UK government and the US government actually for a lot of the work that's happened in the past decade and a half in building up talent, regulatory talent. But if you were to pull apart all of those talents to go to different states to run their state regulatory commissions, you can see where that can be a challenge because we don't have enough regulatory skills in the country. Can we ramp up? Yes, we can, but it may take a number of years to get there. But in summary, I believe that states that are serious, and we've seen a few of them, Enugu is ahead of the pack, Lagos, Edo, Ekiti, these are states that are ahead of the pack. States that get it right can pull the talent they want right now. They can build local generation. They can solve the transmission problem. They can bring in new private capital, to help solve the power problems in their states. The states that do not start now may have a challenge, going forward. But in summary, implemented right, the state electricity market should liberate and create multiple flywheels that could turn around the economy. But we must pay attention, to some of the challenges that may still subsist.
When you were speaking earlier about this, Patrick, I think you very rightly framed it as less about an engineering problem, more about a governance problem or a political problem, right? In terms of a coordination problem, I think you said, an orchestra that's there. If we've got 36 states, and I think our viewers and listeners should be aware that a lot of these states are not that small, right? So if we take Kaduna State, for example, the population of Kaduna State is broadly equivalent to the population of Rwanda, right? So a nation state. So these aren't, most of the states are not so small that they shouldn't be able to have a critical mass or they shouldn't be able to have viability for these things. Is it a problem if we see some states race ahead because their state governors perhaps say, right, we know that the biggest thing we can deliver for our people, for businesses, for households is to get serious on the power sector, and we're going to crack on, and we're not going to let, those that don't want to move forward stand in our way? Is that a problem? Is that just like a balancing out? Those are the states that will attract future investment, future jobs, things that will then benefit their people. Is that the way that we get improvements, do you think? Or is it going to create a lot of inequality in the country?
You see, that's the core thesis of the state electricity markets is that we're hoping some states will jump forward and move and implement and innovate and do things that the rest of the states can then look at and copy and move on. So one of the things that has held us back as a country is wanting to move every part of the country to, move them ahead together. Yeah. So, if we've got admissions to the universities and there are only 100 slots, we've got to balance it out and ensure that every state gets a share. When there are some states that have, people who can do best if given that opportunity, and the rest would learn and catch up. Yeah. What this law has done now is it's put the onus on the states. So we can no longer blame the president of the country when there is no power. You can turn around and blame a state governor. What would the state governor do in that instance? He would look around and see, is there any of my colleague governors who's cracked the code? And if they have, I can sit with them and say, how did you do it? And then implement for my people. So I think at the core of what we're hoping would happen is that some states would move fast, learn, make some mistakes, correct it, and the state school, I'm holding myself back from calling them laggards, would learn and avoid some of those mistakes, try some other things, and that ultimately over time, the country would move forward. Instead of what we've done in the past of trying to move everyone at the same time and not achieving results. So at the heart of it is this hope that some people move forward and then the others will learn.
Thanks, Patrick. What a hope it is. And I hope, like my own state, I hope we'll be able to do this. So I want to go back to your thoughts on cost reflective tariffs.
Mhm.
tariffs. Definitely, Nigerians not used to be paying so much for electricity. And then we had the band A. The backlash was massive, but the government has held their ground. So, for those new to this topic, can you explain the logic behind increasing prices as a prerequisite for fixing the system? This is bearing in mind we spoke earlier about the fact that throwing money is not going to completely solve the problem.
So, I mean, I think most people, the global audience, would understand this. That if, let me look for another analogy. If you're a baker and you have to use these different ingredients to make a loaf of bread, and it costs you, let's say, $1 to make the loaf of bread. And when you go out to sell it, you only make 60 cents on the loaf of bread. It doesn't take a lot of great insight to see that you're going to be out of business soon. And that is what has happened in Nigeria. It cost a particular amount to produce a kilowatt hour of power. But we have, in this confusion between whether we are a socialist state or we're a market-facing state, we have continued to subsidize. So the government continues to subsidize that $1. And for those who pay, they pay a fraction of the dollar. Well, we've done this for decades, and it's clear that we cannot build a thriving system that way. In the past, when some of us have argued that we need to remove the subsidies on power and have people pay for what they use, the argument is, oh, but the people are so poor that they can't pay. And the flip argument I make is, but they pay for their phones though. We figured out how to pay for our GSM phones, including when you can't pay, you flash someone or you call and cut it off, and the person calls you back. We've learned certain behavior that has allowed us to keep using phones and for that sector to grow. So when we come back to the power sector, what we've done in the past is that government has subsidized everyone, including people who can pay. And that has led to a spike in the subsidy, too much debt on our books, and we haven't solved the power problem. In fact, the sector has continued to die. So we argued for, and thankfully won the argument for, a service-based tariff system. What does this mean in practice? It means that we can segment the customers and have people who are in band A, band B, band C, band D, band E. And the banding is based on the number of hours of power that they get. So I'm in band A. It means that contractually, I will get 3 hours or more of supply every day. And any day that it drops from 20, and because I get that, I pay a certain amount of money, which is close enough to cost reflective. So it's close enough to that $1 it costs to bake the bread. It's still not the $1, which doesn't make sense, but it's close enough. Now, in band B, you get less number of hours and you pay less for that, all the way until you get to E. The idea is that the people who are in the lower bands, the people who are less economically stable, get less power and they pay less. And as they pay for the power, they can graduate to band D, band C, etc. The logic again is that as they use the power for productive use, they're making more money and they can, rise up the band levels. That makes sense. And when people pushed against it when it was first introduced, the government held strong because they knew that the economics of it made sense. They knew that the psychology of it made sense. And it's working out today. And we hope that if we can hold on to it, we can gradually get to a cost reflective. Now, here's the point. Everyone who uses generators today knows that what we pay for 1 kilowatt hour generator costs more than what we pay for 1 kilowatt hour from the grid as band A or band whatever you're in. The sooner we can get to a tariff that replaces the cost of producing that loaf of bread, that is when you have a system, a market that works. That is when the private owners, the discos, can pay for the power they've gotten, and the gencos can make enough money to pay to keep generating. I know that there's still the transmission problem in between, but the State Electricity Market Act has addressed that because we don't need to rely so much on transmitting between states. You can generate within the state and distribute within the state.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, just one challenge, I guess, to that model, which otherwise makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? You know, the bread costs up $1 to make, and you can't sell it sustainably for 60 cents per loaf of bread. What about, though, if people are arguing actually this deal with the power company for producing this electricity was actually inflated in terms of the costs? Actually, the guys who were in the administration before us say they didn't do a very good job negotiating. Why should the people suffer because of the bad negotiation that happened previously? How does that change things? Do you think those are valid arguments, or do you think that actually that's more noise in the system?
I think it's all noise. I don't think it's a valid argument. You remember, I'm not sure if you were in Nigeria, no, you probably were not, when the GSM licenses were, and I keep going back to GSM because it's something that most Nigerians can relate to. When the GSM licenses were bidded for and awarded, the cost for making a 1-minute phone call in Nigeria was exorbitant. It was high. But what then happened? Competition. With 3 or 4 different licenses, you could switch between phone companies. And as more people bought the phones and the phone lines and made calls and competition intensified, there was a consistent, steady drop in the cost of making phone calls that today, most Nigerians really do not think, okay, maybe let me pull that back. You know, most Nigerians can make phone calls and it doesn't break the bank, right? The same thing has happened with data. When we started getting internet data, it was expensive, competition, increased use, etc. The cost of data is now dropping off. I think the same thing is going to happen in the power sector. When people begin to use power, if it's more reliable, you can depend on the grid power. Grid power is still far cheaper than what all of us are paying for self-generation. Far cheaper. And if the power companies can guarantee steady, reliable supply, we can all pack up our generators and we will be saving money. So the argument about, what the former government negotiated, etc., I think it's neither here nor there. I think what we need to focus on is to insist on discipline. The guys who bought those companies must do what they signed up to do. And if we have discipline and we have increased supply and we rebuild trust, we can get the rates to drop over time. And it will be for the better for everybody because we are already paying a whole lot more in self-generation or even in opportunity cost, than we are paying from the grid.
Thanks, Patrick. My first job in Nigeria was working in Federal Inland Revenue Service for Afoiko Omoigui, now Okaro, when she was taking the reforms forward from FIRS. And the traditional thing you would see is, as you were asking Nigerians to pay more tax, they would say, why should we pay more tax? We're not getting the services, so we won't pay tax until we get the services. Isn't it a bit like that in the power sector? People don't want to pay the tariffs until they have the trust that they're going to get the uninterrupted provision.
So Ifweko she's a legend. She was a guest on my podcast just last week, and I had a fantastic time talking with her. And yes, you're right on the money. There will always be that question about, chicken and egg, which comes first. Should you supply first before the people pay, or should they pay before you supply? And what I say is you need to just get in the market and figure it out. The power companies need to just keep supplying, and the people need to, be made to know that they have to pay. I know that there's a trust deficit in the country. I understand that. For many years, we've suffered, I don't want to get all political here, but there's a trust deficit. Yeah. But how do we rebuild the trust? We rebuild the trust by insisting that the discos, the distribution companies, deploy meters in homes. If you deploy meters in homes, and I can look at my meter and I see that I know how much I've agreed based on my band that I should be paying per kilowatt hour, and I look at my meter, I look at what I've used, I multiply by the rate, and I see that I'm charged transparently for what I've used, I'll keep using it because it is still far cheaper for me to use grid power than to self-generate. The second part of it is, the service-based tariffs. Remember the bands. The bands say that you're going to get 20 hours or 15 hours or 10 hours, and for that, you're getting this amount of money. If there's a transparent system where I can see on my meter how many hours of power I got, and if I drop below what has been agreed, I can see the meter automatically take me down to a lower rate. If there is that transparency, people will pay. It goes back to the Ifweko example that you mentioned. Yeah, when the people saw that the taxes are being collected from everyone, not just a few people, and that there was no way around it, everybody paid. Now, once you paid, you turned around and said, now I want the government to show me what they're doing with my money. That's the same thing that's going to happen in the power sector. If I can look at my meter and I see I'm getting my 20 hours and you're charging me the rate that was agreed by NERC, and when it drops to a lower supply, you are penalized, I'll pay. And because the discos do not want to be penalized, they will supply the power that they're supposed to supply. So again, it goes back to that marketing discipline and the coordination that's required to get every part of the market to work.
So Patrick, a lot of the arguments you're making around it being cheaper to move to Band A than to self-generate, run generators or perhaps solar or whatever, it kind of assumes that households or businesses are, when there's no electricity, they're switching on the gen. And they're switching on the gen for as long as there's no electricity, right? In reality, though, what happens when they're rationing it? So, when the electricity goes, they're not putting on the gen for all the time. Maybe they're putting it on for an hour, 2 hours, and then maybe they're lighting candles instead or whatever. Does it still make sense to pay the Band A in those scenarios?
So that the assumption here is not that when the light goes, they put on the gen. No, that's not the assumption. The assumption is that for every time you use your gen, whatever power you generate in the period when you're using your gen, 1 kilowatt hour of that power is more expensive than 1 kilowatt hour for when you have grid-based power. So it's a one-to-one comparison. For 1 kilowatt generated, self-generated, it's more expensive than when you get it through the grid. Even when the grid is cost reflective. So right now it's a no-brainer, but even when we get the grid as to be cost reflective, it will still be cheaper. That's the argument. And I think most people get it. The challenge is that it is unreliable. Now, the difference here is you're in the UK. If you step into a room, you put on the lights. When you leave the room, you turn it off because you know that if you leave it on, you're paying, right? But you know for a fact that when you switch on that you flick the switch, there's going to be power. In our case, we know that there won't be. And sometimes when you flip the switch, there's power from the grid. Sometimes not. So you're not able to plan, which means you always have your self-generation as your constant. We need to get to a point where people know that I can rely on the grid. Once we get to that point, they can get rid of the generator, get rid of all the other paraphernalia for self-generation, and what we're getting from the grid will be far cheaper. Initially, you touched on something that I didn't address, which is the potential for solar, rooftop solar, etc., etc. Everyone who's switched to rooftop solar and a combination of solar, batteries, and inverters knows that it is because they can rely on it. It is way better for them. Now, the problem is you need that bulk capital to be able to acquire it from day one. Now, there are some companies, some of them we're involved with, that's looking for ways to help people acquire rooftop solar without having to out a lot of money upfront. So we're beginning to look at rooftop solar as financing a car or a mortgage, where we can spread it out over X number of years and you pay every month. And it still makes sense compared to, it's still financially advantageous over petrol generators or diesel generators. But the challenge is that we must have that patient capital to be able to provide, that mortgage upfront. So there are many of these things that we're trying out. Some of them would work, some maybe not. But there is a lot of innovation that's going on right now to address many of the challenges we still face in the power sector.
All right, so looking ahead, Patrick, is the future for Nigeria's power sector, is it a unified system like, I guess, NIAF 1 and perhaps NIAF 2, the UK government programs that were supporting power sector reform, sort of, I guess, had in mind what the federal government had in mind for decades and decades, right? That it would be a uniform system? Or is it this new model of 36 states plus the FCT having all their own separate systems? Or is it even households just having solar, getting access to finance and putting solar panels on and forgetting about state governments, forgetting about the federal government? What's the future direction for the sector?
And this is an argument, a very important question. It's an argument that's currently ongoing, within the circles, policy circles in Nigeria. And my view is that I think we're going to have a grid of grids, right? I think we're still going to have the national grid that transmits power from major sources of generation to other parts of the country. So I can see where the southeast, the south-south, parts of the southwest become major centers of power generation, but you still need the big trunk lines to trunk them to some far-flung parts of the country. So the national grid will still be there. I see a lot of the states, maybe not all 36, but a lot of the states having their own state grids that will transmit power within the state. So you can have parts of the state where generation companies are set up, and then you need to transmit to other parts of the state. I can see where regions can come together and have regional grids. So I know that the Southwest, the states of the Southwest, in implementing the state electricity their state electricity plans, are thinking of how do we standardize our laws, how do we standardize our plans, such that you can have a grid that connects the states in the Southwest. The Southeast states are thinking about the same as well. Then I think that you're going to have these solar mini grids that the Rural Electrification Agency has done a fantastic job in promoting in parts of the country that have no grid connection. So as you know, about 50% of the country, or maybe about 40%, do not even have any grid connections at all. In those disparate, mostly rural centers, what I see would be smaller mini grids, solar mini grids, or whatever the power source is. In some parts, it could be wind. In some parts, it could be hydro. In some parts, it could be biomass. In some parts, it could be a combination of all of those. But smaller mini grids for smaller communities, mostly rural communities, to power productive use, and then ultimately keep increasing the capacity to serve life. So I think Nigeria is going to be an interesting experiment for the world on how you have a grid of grids, mini grids in the local remote parts, some state or regional, geographically regional grids, all of them working side by side with this national grid. And you can already see, I'm sure you can see how this could be multiple flywheels, but there are also coordination challenges that if we don't have some level of standardization, we could just have a mass of all kinds of things going on, and coordinating them could be an even bigger problem.
Thank you, Patrick. This has been a really interesting conversation so far. And as someone living in the country, a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, but swallow it we must. So I think I wanted to ask if there are any other reforms that are noteworthy that within the power sector, of course, that we should be looking out or thinking about.
Yeah, so first of all, to your comment, is swallow it's hopeful that we're getting closer to the solution. I know that it's difficult for Nigerians to swallow, especially given that we spent probably the last 2 decades trying to reform. But I think that we're getting closer. Every policy that's implemented, there are lessons learned, and I think that we're learning from them and we're trying to implement better. So that's on the one hand. I think there are a number of reforms that we have done well, that we should be proud of. The service-based tariffs, wasn't an easy win. So the banding of the customers, it wasn't an easy win, but I think it's something that would lead to significant success if we can stay strong, keep implementing, learn from the mistakes, correct them as we go along. The other one is what the Renewable Energy Rural Electrification Agency has been pushing, first under Damilola, and now under my good friend. So I think that the mini grids would be a way to solve the challenges that the disparate rural communities are having, and that is a program that has been super successful in my view, because many of these communities that have not had any form of electricity since Adam and Eve walked the earth, are beginning to see electricity. They're beginning to figure out how to put them to productive use, and that's working. There are other reforms we've also talked about, and the state electricity market. It's still early days, but I think the thinking is right. The implementation, like every good reform, would be a challenge, but we're also learning from those. There could be multiple other things that have been going on in the sector. But what I want, if I was talking to Nigerians, what I'd like them to take away from this is you've got good people who are trying to solve very difficult problems. We're spending a lot of time thinking about these issues. There's no rule book to read from. We're doing the best we can, thinking about them deeply, implementing, learning from the mistakes, and trying to fix them. And I think that we're beginning to make some progress, and I hope that we can sustain that progress going forward.
Thank you, Patrick. For any of our viewers and listeners who follow other emerging markets that might have similar power sector challenges, often I find you learn the clearest and sharpest lessons in the most challenging contexts, right? What lessons do you think they could learn from 20 years of power sector reform in Nigeria?
Yeah. I think the biggest lesson for me, which I think could be a good lesson for other countries in the emerging market, is that subsidies could be a trap. They always seem like the politically savvy thing to do. People are hurting. For the government to show that it cares, it provides some subsidy either on petroleum products, on power, on health, or whatever else. The challenge is that it's a trap. Most times, figuring out how to dimension the beneficiaries so that you're not subsidizing the wealthy, that you're subsidizing the people who really need the help, is a bit of a challenge. So you have a situation where the poor, who should get the subsidy, do not get as much, and the wealthy get a lot of the subsidy. So any countries in the global south, in the emerging markets, that's struggling with infrastructure deployment and is tempted to go the subsidy route should know that it's a bit of a trap, and should dimension how they use it very carefully. And like most things, the challenge is not starting, it's how to stop it. And from our experience in Nigeria, we haven't been able to wean ourselves of that. The second one is to start early, to communicate to the people, the consumers, that electricity is a commodity that must be paid for. It is not a social amenity that the government can provide for free. The government may be tempted to do that, but it always ends up badly. So if you start from day one to communicate that point and to figure out how to help the most vulnerable, either using this banding system that we've designed in Nigeria and we're still experimenting with and everyone should pay attention to, or figuring out how to really dimension who the poor are, and provide a subsidy without creating the moral hazard, where they expect that it will be there forever, because it would be really difficult for any government, not even the ones in the most developed economies, to sustain subsidies for so long. I guess those are the two key takeaways for me.
Thank you, Patrick. No, and thank you so much for sharing your insight with us on the podcast. It's been truly a masterclass, and I wish we could take this podcast back in time, back to, I guess, 20 years ago or whatever, and to those that were charting the course for the power sector and taking this all on board. Favor, I noticed you dropped off at some point. I'm not saying this to embarrass you, but just to check, what did you drop off because NEPA took light?
Very, very solid question, but unfortunately, it's the other issue, connectivity. So power sector is not to blame. We'll come back to the
Okay, we'll not
telcos.
blame the power sector for that one then.
Yes.
But actually, you remind me, because when the UK government, DFID at the time, were pitching the business case for NIAF 2 back to London and trying to make the case of why this would be a good investment from the UK side, just as Keith Hammond, the infrastructure advisor, was making a passionate case around the benefits of solving the issues in the power sector, the room in Abuja, the light went, and we were thrown into darkness. And we couldn't have timed it more perfectly in order to illustrate the point of why it was important to solve these challenges. So sometimes NEPA can be helpful in terms of the theatre of making your case. But yes, that's a rather, I guess, weak thing to praise them for. But there we go. But anyway, thank you so much, Patrick. And biggest takeaway from me from what you're saying is, I think the power sector speaks so closely to the core approach of flywheel economics, right? So, do you tackle these problems as engineering problems, or do you tackle these as system problems, as a gardener, as a steward of the overall system? You spoke about the coordination challenge that's involved there. Being the orchestra, being the conductor of the orchestra, and trying to get some sort of tune played in harmony amongst the various parts of the orchestra. And I think that's very aligned with what we believe from the flywheel economics side. So it's been wonderful to hear your insights, Patrick. Thank you for taking the time. And one final thing, Patrick, I know you have your own podcast with Nextier. Do you want to give a quick plug to that?
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks for offering that. So we have a podcast, Development Discourse, with myself, Patrick Okigbo. You can find it on YouTube, and there we interrogate the big development, complex development challenges we have in Africa, and we bring top speakers, top thinkers to just explore potential pathways to resolving them. So thanks for the opportunity to give that plug.
Thank you, and we'll make sure there's a link to your YouTube channel in our podcast episode. So thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you, Favor. All the best.
Thank you, Favor. Thank you, Richard.
Let me hand over. Thank you, Patrick. Let me hand over to Favor now to wrap up.
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. I don't think I could have put it better. Why we hope that the Nigerian government continues to play their part and make sure that our hopes aren't dashed. As Nigerians, we also definitely have our own part to play. As I said, it's not been easy, but it is very, very necessary. And just as Richard said, if there's one takeaway from today's episode, is that it's not just about the wires and the gas and the hydro. It's definitely about how do we ensure we bring all these parts together to ensure that the whole system is able to spin. Nigeria's path forward isn't straightforward as much as we would want it to be. It's still step by step, but everybody is going to need to play their parts. So thank you very much again to Patrick, and to our dear listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the Flywheel Economics Podcast on wherever you stream your podcast. And it's because it really helps us to bring more of these complex and global stories to light. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment. Across all our social media platforms, we're on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle across board is Flywheel Economics. So while we will be back next, please ensure that you keep following us and join us on our website as well to go deeper on topics just like this. But until we bring you the next deep dive, this has been the Flywheel Economics Podcast.